Nicolas Lemery was an alchemist. A short essay written and read by Bruce Mills, otherwise known as the Obligate Pedestrian. Nicolas Lemery, 1645 to 1715. Cours de chimie, 1675, by Lemery. I'm working from the third English edition, translated from the 8th edition in the French, which is very much enlarged beyond any of the former, printed by R.N. for Walter Kettilby at Bishop's Head in S. Paul's Churchyard, 1698. And Nouveau edition, review, corrigé et augmenté d'un grand nombre de notes et plusieurs préparations chimiques qui sont aujourd'hui de usage et dont il n'est fait aucune mention dans les éditions de l'auteur, par M. Baron, docteur en médecine, et de l'Académie royale des sciences, 1757. Did the French have the same split between the words alchemy and chymistry that occurred in English? I get the feeling they did not, at least not as strongly. They at least had chymie, archaic with a Y, and chymie, modern, but I'm not sure that this had any semantics attached. The 21st century literature refers to Lemery as a chemist and not an alchemist. Why? So far, the most significant part of the naming of one person of a chemist and another as an alchemist seems to be that those in the 21st century agree with the work of the former and disagree with the latter. If they agree with some ideas and disagree with other ideas, then the person is in the transition from alchemist to chemist, from magic to science, and might be forgiven for their transgressions due to the culture in which they lived. Note, Lemery, a course in chymistry, includes a section on chemical symbols which are typically recognised in the 21st century as alchemical symbols, such as caput mortuum. I've yet to find a definitive objective criterion, although Boyle's division seems to be that the alchemists work with the 4 elements and the chymists work with the 3 principles. Reading between the lines of several works including Boyle, Lemery, Keel and Freind, that's actual John Freind, not friends, the chemist seems to be those that felt that a new and much more complicated collection of elementary materials were required. Of course, history did eventually validate this view empirically. However, Becher started with the 4 elements and modified them, removing some, adding others, which seems to qualify him as a chemist, but he is said to be an alchemist. This is presumably more because his line of theoretical descendants led through Stahl and Priestley to the wrong side of the phlogiston debate in the late 18th century. Lemery is credited with being the first person to work seriously on a theory of acid-base reactions, hence he is promoted to chemist in the 21st century language. The history section of the term chemistry in the Wikipedia, July 2023, reads at best as a clear conflict of interest between the writers, on the one hand saying that chemistry has been around since 500 BC, and then saying that its proto-science, as though each science had to have one, was alchemy, and claiming that the distinction was the use of the scientific method starting in the late 16th century with Francis Bacon, then saying that chemistry only became a science with Lavoisier at the end of the 18th century. My own impression from reading the books of the 17th century is that the revolution, if there was one, in chemistry was a shift from experiment to theory, not from philosophy, that is theory, to experiment. The alchemists favoured large axiom sets that had direct experimental meaning and disparaged the work of the chemists as being too far from practical experience. The chemists claimed that the alchemists misunderstood the experiments, by which they meant that the alchemists did not interpret the experiments in the same light as the chemists. But that is not an objective criteria for proclaiming someone to be non-scientific. If that is the path to the definition of science, then any theory that is no longer accepted is non-scientific, and science does not mean the methodology but the conclusion, and is entirely subjective, rather like fashion. The definition I will continue to use is that science is in the method. Also, the alchemists were closer to right in the short term, It was not until 300 years later that the truly mathematical approach to the description of the elements worked under the name quantum chemistry. Some people classify alchemists specifically as those that were strongly interested in the philosopher's stone, or perhaps in the transmutation of the classical metals, and so say that Lemery was not an alchemist because he was not interested in that. But this does not seem to have been any really universal obsession. Read books such as Summa Perfectionis, and it is clear that alchemists work on general laboratory chemistry. Such things as the philosopher's stone were mentioned, but not the focus of the book. In the same way, a quantum mechanic might work on, say, fusion reactors. But that does not mean that the goal of quantum mechanics is fusion reactors. Sometimes it is claimed that the 17th century scientific chemistry marked the end of the obsession with the alkahest and the philosopher's stone, but neither Pseudo-Geber of the 14th century nor Roger Bacon of the 13th century seemed obsessed with either. Nor was Al-Razi or Zosimus obsessed. There was plenty of work to do other than the philosopher's stone, including medicines and munitions. This does not mean that the topic of the philosopher's stone did not turn up. In particular, Johann Becher published Magnalia Naturae in 1680. The more complete title is The Philosopher's Stone lately exposed to public sight and sale, being a true and exact account of how Wenceslas Celeru, the late famous projection maker at the Emperor's court at Vienna, came by and made away with a very great quantity of powder of projection by projecting with it before the Emperor and a great many witnesses, selling it, etc., for some years past. Published at the request and for the satisfaction of several curious, especially of Mr. Boyle. End of quote. This smacks very much of some of the writings of John Dee, who was talked into believing some mystical principles of angels by one Edward Kelly, who is seen by history as a serial confidence trickster. The preface is a lengthy monologue on how true the events described must be. The powder of projection was another name for the philosopher's stone. In modern terms, it was claimed to be a substance which, when mixed with certain metals, would convert them into other metals. I do not believe at this time that Lemery ever wrote a similar claim. However, my claim is that excluding this, the theory of Lemery and Becher have a similar basis, and the interest of Becher in the philosopher's stone needs to be kept in context. Becher, 1635 to 1682. In 1669, at 34 years old, Becher published Physica Subterranea, which is considered to be a solid work on mineralogy. It is in stark contrast to the Magnalia Naturae, written a decade later. At the age of 40, Becher is quoted as saying, "Chemists are a strange class of mortals, impelled by an almost insane impulse to seek their pleasure among smoke and vapour, soot and flame, poisons and poverty, yet among all these evils I seem to live so sweetly that I would die if I were to change places with the Persian king." Circa 1675, Supplementum to Physica Subterranea. In 1678, according to a Harvard biography and information from Encyclopaedia Britannica, Johann Becher visited Holland and tried to set up a project to extract gold from sand. I do not find evidence that this involved explicit use of transmutation, but rather was about extracting gold from low-grade ore, a common process today. The details vary, but shortly after he abandoned his family and went to England. He was only 43 at the time, but is unclear his state of health. The 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica states that he fled to Holland and then to England due to persecution from Zinzendorf. However, what problem Zinzendorf had with Becher is unknown. In 1680, Becher published Magnalia Naturae, a book claiming that Wenceslas Celeru managed to create the philosopher's stone. Becher died 2 years later at the age of 47. Just before his death, in 1682, he returned to London and wrote Chemische Gluckenschaften oder große Konkordanz und Collection von 1500 Processen, in which, among 1,500 chemical processes, he described one for creating the philosopher's stone to turn lead into gold. He died a few months later. It is quite possible that Becher's interest in the philosopher's stone was a result of personality changes brought about by unintentional self-inflicted poisoning, and it represents a drift away from his earlier more mundane and grounded work on metallurgy and mineralogy. On the other hand, it is also true that stories of transmutations were rather common in those days, and like stories of alien visitations in the late 20th century, were not entirely dismissed by serious researchers. However, I personally feel that Becher is far less rational and much more rhetorical in the Magnalia Naturae than in Physica Subterranea. The principle of manufacturing gold was a simple natural implication of the extant theory. A nuclear theory of the 20th century shows that the principle was actually sound anyway. To apply the principle in a medieval setting that the gold element is element 79 and cannot be transformed by chemical means, hence the alchemists were deluded, is parochial and anachronistic. Stated in modern terms, the alchemists were aware of the distinction between chemical and nuclear reactions and knew that the latter were harder, but were trying to find a way to achieve this. Taking into account the Farnsworth fusor, the idea was not totally without merit. What the alchemists did not know at the time was that electricity was the key to understanding chemistry, but the chemists of the 17th century did not know that either. Gold at the time was more of a spectrum. No method to identify individual atoms was available. That had to wait until the 19th century at least. Identification of gold was in terms of a material with various mechanical and chemical properties. The principle being tried out was to gradually find ways to make something that passed more and more of the tests of being gold until it was the best quality as gold. Hence, what is sometimes referred to in the 21st century as 14th century fake or counterfeit gold was just as viably simply poor quality gold. The arguments about what was true gold at the time were strongly analogous to the arguments in the 20th century of natural products being superior to manufactured ones, regardless of what the chemical tests declare. So in terms of the 21st century sensibilities, the 14th century opponents of transmutation were no more enlightened than the proponents. In 21st century terms, the manufacture of one element from others in a nuclear furnace, such as stars, does not involve a sequence of steps through elements that are chemically closer and closer to gold, but rather involves the fusion or fission of elements that are chemically very different, but whose atomic number and nuclear stability are just right. It is said that Lemery eschewed the Paracelsian principles and used the Cartesian and atomistic principles. Of course, the atomistic and corpuscular theory were around since antiquity alongside the essence principles, and the essence principles are rather like the principle of the quantum field in the 20th century. Not as precise or accurate, science has advanced over the centuries, but definitely the same basic kind of principle of a thing that pervades all time and place and interact locally with other such things. Lemery is reported to have developed the principle that acids were corpuscles with spikes on them, presumably because they felt sharp to the tongue, way to go scientific method, and that alkalis, their opposite, naturally had pores into which these spikes stuck. This can be seen to be a precursor of the theory of atomic bonds. For example, using the proton donor theory of acids, the spike is the proton and the hole is wherever the proton goes. Although then the corpuscles are molecules with hydrogen as a component and not atoms. The theory of Lemery is clearly quite primitive, even compared to the proton donor theory, which is fine. It is acceptable as a precursor, as long as the notions of the alchemists are not dismissed here. Otherwise, there's a double standard of accepting one primitive notion and dismissing another because of culture and politics. Holes and spikes are not a good description of the mechanism of evolution of quantum states as the atoms approach each other, except in terms of a vague analogy, and something that causes them to stick. One early definition of a salt, not just table salt, but a class of chemicals called salts, is that which form from the combination of an acid and an alkali. In particular, a Dictionary of Chemistry and Mineralogy by Andrew Urey, 4th edition, 1831, states, "Salt is a term usually employed to denote a compound in definite proportions of acid matter with an alkali earth or a metal oxide. The Chambers Encyclopedia of 1728 does define acids by starting with the notion of being sharp on the tongue, but that is a matter of sour taste, not cutting. The analogy to the principle that acids are literally sharp at an atomic level is overdoing it. That the acids literally cut the tongue is not an entirely nonsensical idea, but the spikes of Lemery just fit into the holes in the alkalis and not cutting anything. In French, Cours de chimie by Lemery starts very much along the same lines as Boyle and quite a few other authors of the time. Many a preface could be shortened to "I am right and they are wrong, muhaha." La plupart des auteurs qu'on parle de la chimie en ont écrit avec tant d'obscurité qui semblent avoir vers le possible pour n'être pas entendus. End of quote. Loosely translated, most people who write about chemistry write in such an obscure manner that you wonder whether they even want to be understood. This is remarkably similar to statements made by Boyle and Freind all about the same time, around the end of the 17th century and the start of the 18th. My French reading is not great, although it's a lot better than my pronunciation would suggest. So I continued by working with an English translation published in 1698, 20 years after the French original. In the chapter on chymistry in general, it is stated about the etymology of chymistry. The word chymistry is derived from the Greek word chymos, a juice, or from kien, to melt, because it teaches us to separate the purer substances of mixed bodies, which are sometimes called juices, and because it shows us how to melt things that are of a more solid nature. Some draw it from the Hebrew word chema, which signifies a hot constellation, but this derivation is strained too far. The chymists have added the Arabian particle L to the word chymi, intended to give it a sublime significance, as particularly when the transmutation of metals is understood by it, though otherwise alchemy signifies no more than chemistry. End of quote. The word appears to be in ancient Greek, chi, epsilon, epsilon iota nu, where there is an acute on the first epsilon that seems to make it sound as kain or keen, kim, which could be chem, especially due to the H sounding K from the Arabic context. This is particularly interesting, since the word alchemy or alchemy clearly predates chemistry and chymistry. From reading the earlier literature, it came from the dropping of the L, which was there because it was transliterated from Arabic sources that kick-started the European study of the topic. Lemery has the etymology the wrong way round. In particular, he claims that the alchemists are trying to be posh by adding the L, when the historical treatment is closer to that the chemists were trying to be posh by dropping the L. See De Re Metallica by Agricola a century earlier. Alchymia predates chimia. But also it is noteworthy that Lemery confirms that chimia and alchymia mean the same thing, which seems accurate. The only distinction he makes is the incorrect assertion that alchymia is being posh, and this is in the late 1600s. Later, Lemery says, chemistry is an art that teaches how to separate the different substances which are found in mixed bodies. I mean by mixed bodies those that naturally grow and increase, such as minerals, vegetables, and animals. Under the name of minerals I comprehend the 7 metals, minerals, stones, and earths. Under vegetables I understand plants, gums, rosins, fruits, and the several kinds of fungus, seeds, juices, flowers, mosses, and whatsoever else came from them. And under animals I contain both the animals themselves and whatsoever belongs to them as their parts and excrements. End of quote. In saying that mixed bodies are those things that grow and increase, this does not sound like what mixed would mean to the 21st century ear. However, it might well be a definition along the lines of the one for life that is used in the 21st century biology by some. Life is what evolves. That is, mixed or compound materials are complicated things that are generated by some process under special conditions over time. Minerals are formed in the earth, bread is baked in the oven, and babies incubate in the mother. Start of quote. But before I begin to speak particularly of all these things, I believe it will be convenient to say something of the principles of chymistry and give a general idea of furnaces, lures, the degrees of fire, and terms that may occasion obscurity. End of quote. In saying that he wishes to talk of the principles and of the nature of furnaces and to not be obscure, he is repeating the sentiment of the pre-17th century alchemist. At a time before the existence of the word chymist, such as in Summa Perfectionis, or for that matter in the Letters on Magnetism by Peter Peregrini in 1269, and given that chemistry was eventually explained by quantum electrodynamics, it must surely be considered also to be the precursor of 21st century chemist. Start of quote. The first principle that can be admitted for the composition of mixtures is a universal spirit which, being diffused through all the world, produces different things according to the different matrices or pores of the earth in which it settles. But because this principle is a little metaphysical and falls not under the sense, it will be fit to establish some sensible ones. Wherefore I shall relate those that are commonly held. End of quote. That is fairly much the principle of universal water of Thales circa 600 BC, or the principle of the four elements as described by Empedocles circa 450 BC. Start of quote. Whereas the chymists in making the analysis of mixed bodies have met with 5 sorts of substances, they therefore conclude that there were 5 principles of natural things: water, spirit, oil, salt, and earth. Of these 5, 3 of them are active: the spirit, the oil, and salt. They call them active because, by reason of their great motion, they cause all manner of action, and other passives because, being in repose themselves, they only serve to stop and hinder the motion of the actives. End of quote. Here Lemery is again speaking of the abstract theory in a manner that does not fully acknowledge this. Rephrasing, we could say that it is the cladistics, that there is an experimental determination of materials that are water, spirits, oils, salts, and earths, and that they have certain properties. It is also claimed implicitly that they are neither created nor destroyed, and that they form everything by combinations. When dry organic matter is heated, the spirit is driven off first, and then the oil, and the earth is left at the end and never rises. The claim is that the principles are named water, earth, spirit, oil, salt, but the axioms of the theory are multiple and explained through the discussion of the reactions. The definition of oil is through the long list of ways in which it behaves. A few decades later, Freind would complain about the failure of earlier writers to use brief axiom lists, and his opponents would complain quite rightly that brief axiom lists are hard to use. Compare the theory of Lemery to the theory of Becher 1635-1682, a little earlier, who used water, earth, terra lapidea, terra fluida, and terra pinguis. The pinguis of Becher corresponds fairly explicitly to the oil of Lemery 1645-1715. The lapidae was the stony hard part which can be related to salt, and fluida, the soft part which can be related to spirit. The theories correspond very strongly. Terra pinguis was later, 1703, named, or rather identified as the pre-existing principle of phlogiston by George Stahl, 1659-1734. One significance of the work of Becher, Stahl, and Priestley is that they were contributing to the idea that there were more than just 4 elementary materials. Lemery had the same basic idea, but used more classical names, merging the earth, water, air, and fire elements with the sulfur, salt, mercury principles. Lemery continues on, giving some particularly good discussion of the general background and the expectations of the words spirit, oil, and salt. However, it would be rather forced reading to see this as 21st century style chemistry, or even 19th century. It is far more connected conceptually to the work of Thales, Geber, Pseudo-Geber, Paracelsus, all predating Lemery, mostly by multiple centuries, than it is to the work of Lavoisier just a century later.